So I get asked all the time how I'm able to travel pretty much full-time without a real job. And I just wanted to tell you a little bit about that today. My journey, kind of how I got to this point, and give you some tips for how you might be able to do the same thing. So there's about 1 million ways that you can travel for cheap, or even free. But since it's so varied, I'm just going to tell you my personal story over the last year, now that I've been on the road full-time for a little over a year, and then share some tips on how you could travel for cheaper or stretch your trip farther for the same price. So in January of 2022, I started full-time life on the road in my older 4Runner, and I ended up doing a road trip around the West Coast, all the way up from Northern California, kind of following slowly up the coast towards Seattle. And I got there in April, and luckily I was able to stay with family for about 2 months in the Seattle area doing some work projects. I'm a filmmaker. If you're new here, that's one of my tips. If you're able to stay with family, I really feel very grateful for that. I know not everybody has that option. And then in June, I ended up selling my 4Runner and getting something a little bigger. I was looking, hopefully, to be able to stand up in something, and I ended up buying an old Toyota Chinook, and I built it out in a week, and I'll link the video up here for the build video if you want to see it. But I built it out in in the street in front of a friend's house, because I was pretty anxious to get back on the road. And I took it down to Bend, Oregon for about a month, kind of for the rest of the summer, and survived a giant heat wave. It was over 100 for like 2 weeks straight. It was ridiculous. Pretty much spent the whole rest of the summer swimming in the river. And while I was there, I bought a plane ticket to Hawaii, and then I took the Chinook back up to Seattle. I had a wedding client for a wedding video I did in early September there, and hopped on the plane, and I flew to Hawaii, and I worked on a farm there for just a hair over a month. And that whole trip, including the plane ticket and food and everything, ended up costing me $600 roughly for a full month, pretty much. And that's one of my biggest tips, is being able to volunteer somewhere in exchange for housing, basically. But again, we'll get to the tips here in a minute. Booked a ticket to Alaska, and I was able to do some Couchsurfing there, which is my first time using that website, which is awesome. And I went up to actually look at land and kind of get a feel for how much I might like it up there long term, at least in the summers. And while I was there, I rented a car from the folks I was Couchsurfing with, actually, so that was a good way to save some money. And I did a big road trip around, leaving from Anchorage up to Talkeetna and back. Right after I got back from Alaska, I left on probably my biggest, craziest adventure yet, which was an 800-mile bike tour from Vancouver Island to Eureka in Northern California. And I would have probably gone all the way to Mexico, but the weather was crazy and the roads kept getting closed, and it was like dumping rain and snow, and I basically was just forced to turn around. But that pretty much rounded out my year. I ended up stopping the ride just about on Christmas, I think, so pretty much right at the end of the year. And that was a pretty epic way to finish off a full year on the road. So I want to run through some tips, ideas, and maybe give you a little inspiration for how to save some money. All of these have come from years of travel, and I've put each one of them into use in practice. And so I want to organize this list from the easiest that like anybody could do without really any planning or forethought, down to a little more advanced, maybe some more planning, and a little more adventurous. So number one on our list is visiting friends and family. And I know this doesn't really sound like travel necessarily, but hear me out. Maybe you take your camera along and go out and shoot some photos. And even if it's a city you live in, sometimes just getting out of the house is a really good excuse to go out and explore, and maybe you'll learn something about the place you've lived for years. And it's pretty much zero stress and usually free. Maybe you offer to cook dinner or help with some chores in exchange for a place to stay for the weekend, even if it's just crashing on the couch. So number 2 is van life or car life, and this basically falls under the category of camping. It's just, for some people, a little easier and a little more comfortable, especially in bad weather. And the benefit here is that the only extra expense you'd have is gas, and depending on the kind of car you have and how far you actually drive, this could be not any different than you'd spend driving around town. Even if you don't have a van, a small hatchback is still pretty comfortable to sleep in, and for just a couple-day trip, it's super accessible. So third on the list is hostels, and it's a great way to save money, especially if you're in Southeast Asia. I've seen dorm room hostels for literally $2 a night with breakfast. And even in more expensive places like Canada and the US, hostels are a great way to save some money. I stayed in Victoria, which is typically a very expensive city, in a hostel for $26 a night US, and that included free breakfast and a free beer. And I know some people are maybe a little nervous about staying in a dorm room basically with a bunch of other people, but it's really not that bad. Just bring some like earplugs and an eye mask and you'll be fine. So Couchsurfing is a website that allows people to basically host strangers in their house, which sounds weird at first, but if you think about it, it's actually super cool because it's free, so there's no like monetary exchange. You don't have to worry about that. And for the people hosting, it's a great way for them to meet new people and be able to kind of travel a little bit without actually leaving their house. So that might actually be something to look into if you're interested in that. But as a traveler, it's also super valuable because it's pretty much free accommodation, and not to mention that, it's a great way to meet locals and get tips on some of the best things to do and ways you can save money when you're traveling. And so probably the cheapest way to travel is, I would say, bike touring or true backpacking, where not like the Europe style backpacking where you're kind of bouncing around on trains in between cheap flights, but like true backpacking where you're just like walking with a backpack, particularly in areas where you can camp, or maybe combine that with couchsurfing, because the only expense you have is like your health insurance, which you'd have to pay for with any of these, and your food and maybe camping equipment, but you're not paying for transportation, you're not paying for accommodation, and those are the two that are typically the most expensive parts of any trip. And now I know this isn't for everybody.
Why the hell did I decide to do this in the winter? It's hailing or snowing.
But I wanted to put it in here because if you are interested in that, I would really recommend it. My bike tour was probably one of the craziest experiences of my life. I have so many great memories and amazing photos from that trip. And so I basically want to sum up this whole entire video with one tip, and that is to travel slow. And all of my tips and recommendations have kind of centered around this because, again, your most expensive thing usually is your transportation. So the less of that you have, the more money you're going to save. And the longer you stay somewhere, the easier it is to buy groceries instead of going out to eat. The easier it is to find good tips on ways to save money. Workaway, for example, or Woof is the other website. Typically, those are longer stays of upwards of a month, and that would be my top recommendation. Just go somewhere for a month, and many countries you can stay in for a month without a visa or anything like that. And it's also a really powerful way to get to know the local culture and actually make some friends that maybe you get to see more than once, which is really nice and kind of rare when you're traveling. Anyway, I want to keep this video pretty short and to the point, but hopefully that's been helpful. And if you're new here, I definitely encourage you to check out some of my other videos. I make travel films, and I want to start doing some more travel tips and tutorials and that kind of thing. So please consider subscribing, and hitting like really helps out with the YouTube algorithm. But anyway, thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.